Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. On the 24th of February, just some 12 days ago, Russia launched a brutal invasion of Ukraine. In the following days, thousands of people, including far too many civilians, have died. Well over 1 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine, become refugees in Western Europe. Millions more are likely internally displaced. Sanctions have led to the Russian economy effectively collapsing, but Europeans are insecure and fearful about their futures. These events are momentous, first and foremost for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. But the impact is felt all around the world, including, of course, in the Baltic States on the border of Russia. Today, for example, in Latvia's top daily, there was a discussion about bunkers, where they are, how to access them, under what occasions people should use them. I'm Daunis. I'm a professor of politics at the University of Latvia, and I'm speaking to you from Latvia today. I'm also the president of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. We decided to hold the first webinar in our history to try to better understand what's going on, where we're heading, perhaps also think about how we can help. We have a panel of leading scholars of the region to discuss these issues with us today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Oxana Shevel, an associate professor of political science at Tufts University, and the president of our sister association, the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. We also have Andris Kasekamp, who is the chair of Estonian Studies and professor of history at the University of Toronto. And in his younger days, he was also a professor at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And Dovilė Budrytė, who will take over the reins of the Association of the Baltic Studies later this year, who is a professor of political science and the chair of faculty at Georgia Gwinnett College. And for you watching us and listening in, please note that the chat is disabled, but we'd very much welcome your questions via the Q&A button on the Zoom. And we'd like to address as many of these questions as we can in the second part of today's 60-minute discussion. But first of all, Oxana, I'd like to turn to you and just ask you to reflect on these events of the last few weeks, what they mean for Ukraine, what they mean for the Ukrainian people. How did we come to this? What's happening on the ground in Ukraine? Oxana, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join your panel. I will not gonna go over current events. I mean, we all follow the news, but I do want to sort of put. I think it says the host muted. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. Okay. So I think if we look at Putin's speeches and sort of his general thinking about Ukraine, right, we clearly see that he has this obsession with Ukraine, which is really sort of tragic because it is he deeply misunderstands it, and then he acts on these misunderstandings in ways that actually damage his own interests that he has vis-a-vis the country. So let me explain a little bit sort of how I see it, right? Like, as many of you know, Ukraine since the end of Soviet Union was often considered so-called divided country. I mean, those of us who study Ukraine, like these divisions are really complex. It's not sort of simple East-West divide, but broadly speaking, there was more kind of Russian-speaking, pro-Russian electorate in the south and the east of the country, again, for historic reasons, and more sort of Western-oriented electorate in the west, and then increasingly the center. And this pattern basically produced, Ukraine had competitive politics, competitive elections. They were not, perfect democracy, but, presidents regularly lost power. That wasn't like Russia and Belarus that somebody came to power and then reliably sat there. Presidents alternated. And we had this invariable pattern that, whoever was elected, say, was the vote for one part of the country, would disappoint the voters and would get voted out, and somebody representing sort of the other geopolitical orientation would come in. So we had this alternation between sort of more pro-Russian, more pro-Western presidents. And all along this time, Russia had plenty of influence over Ukraine. It had influence, of course, electorally. There were reliably pro-Russian parties represented in the parliament. It had influence through the oligarchs, the media, the energy, you name it, right? And none of these interests were going to go away after 2014, or at least not disappear. They potentially could have diminished, right? But after President Yanukovych was driven out by Euromaidan protests in 2014, the electoral geography didn't change, right? People in Donbass and Crimea and Eastern Ukraine more generally were much less supportive of Euromaidan than people in the West. So it's more likely than not that this sort of pattern would have continued, right? And Russia would have continued to have quite a lot of leverage over Ukraine. Of course, this whole NATO membership was a complete hoax. I mean, in Ukraine, and as far as that being a genuine threat from Russia, in Ukraine, up until a few recent years, there was low support for membership in NATO. No more than 20-25% at most supported this. Of course, within NATO, there was also never a consensus on Ukraine joining. So this sort of thing that, like, this somehow a preemptive defensive war, because otherwise Ukraine would have joined NATO and Putin would have placed whatever NATO would have placed whatever missiles aimed at Moscow that, we heard in this unhinged speech that Putin gave. I mean, any of us who study the region, factually, that's completely false, right? But of course, this is not how Putin saw it. So he seems to have, maybe genuinely believed two things. One is that, Ukraine is not really a real country. This is not a real nation. This is very clear in all of his sort of thinking and writing and the kind of apparently historians that he reads. So this whole notion that Ukrainians are somehow this like fake nation. I mean, we can, all those of us who study nations, nationalism and nation building, we of course can take issue with the whole premise that there are artificial, quote unquote, and real nations. All nations are ultimately constructed. So in that sense, like, yes, Ukraine is an artificial nation, but so is Russia and France and any other nation where people come to think of themselves as national community in relatively modern period. But that's of course not how Putin sees it, right? So there is sort of this dual misunderstanding. On the one hand, this is this fake nation, and that where people are ultimately Russian and they are just suppressing their pro-Ukrainian preferences. So when Putin was even presented, questions were asked, in years leading before the invasion, like, what do you think about this change in public opinion? And there has been substantial change in Ukraine, especially since 2014. So again, we have this sort of irony that Putin moves to annex Crimea, start this insurgency in Donbass to supposedly counter threats that objectively speaking did not exist, right? And then as a result of this, he actually produces the very thing he tried to avoid, which is more anti-Russian Ukraine. So we see this change, right? First of all, in electoral geography, where about 12% of the population of the electorate in the most pro-Russian regions no longer vote in Ukrainian elections because they are in the next Crimea or Donbass. And that basically makes it harder for any kind of pro-Russian politician to come to power. And then attitudes in the rest of the country change. So in recent months, for the first time ever, even in the south and the east of the country, support for NATO exceeds opposition, according to recent polls, right? And that's the direct consequence of Putin's attempts to prevent exactly that. So this is really like deeply, deeply ironic and of course also tragic, right? And then his second belief is that essentially Ukraine sort of is like a puppet, right? So it's not a real country. It is basically, a Western puppet. I mean, he talked about any municipality controlled essentially by the US, right? Like any military platoon controlled to the US. So there is this belief that I think he genuinely believed this. I think this is why this invasion happened, and that's why it's going so badly. That once Russian troops move in, the Ukrainians would be free to reveal their true pro-Russian preferences, essentially, right? Would welcome the Russian occupiers, and because the state is basically fake and artificial and propped by the US, it would collapse immediately, right? Now, of course, this is not what we see happening. So this is why we are where we are. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more about how this invasion is going, but it's not going that great for Russia. I mean, it is in imposing tremendous, of course, civilian suffering and destruction. But as far as military success, that's also something kind of, I think all analysts are probably saying, did we overestimate the Russian army? I mean, they have wheels falling off, logistics and so forth, but also Ukrainian resistance, right? Not only the army is still standing and is fighting more efficiently than, many thought, but even the population in the south of Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine, where Russian troops enter, people gather, they come out with Ukrainian flags, they, stand in front of the tanks. So the idea that Putin can somehow win, and maybe I'll end this, to me, it seems completely undoable. I think it's really the question, will he lose quick or will he lose after a period of time? because to control the country of this size, of 44 million people, right, the country the size of France, where literally, I mean, we had now another wave of nation building. These are the Russian-speaking, pro-Russian areas that he's entering. People hate their guts, you know, people who never thought of themselves as sort of patriotic Ukrainians, now like are ready to die for their town, for their country, right? How do you control this, right? Like it would have to be the kind of brutal occupation that Soviet Union imposed, you know, in the Baltic countries for that matter, right? In Western Ukraine after the Second World War, over much smaller territory, smaller population, without that much international support, right? And even there, it took, you know, what it took. So I just don't see, honestly, how there is possible path to victory for Putin. I think we should be thinking, I mean, of course, minimizing civilian casualties is, you know, the primary concern. But I think, you know, Ukraine would emerge from this even more united than ever. We have to think about what's going to happen with Russia, because I think the kind of sanctions that were unleashed, you know, what we see happening with, you know, protests in the society, economic collapse that is forthcoming. I think it's an open question whether or not Putin will be able to hold on there and in what shape, you know, the country would emerge out of this. I mean, they're now really quickly moved to North Korea type dictatorship there, you know, with an independent media cut, 15-year prison sentence for calling the war and so forth. So I'll end here. So I can't really say that it's sort of very optimistic in the way that, you know, people are suffering and being killed every day, and it's more likely than not that that will continue for some time. But as far as the end goal, I think we're going to be looking at completely different Europe, at completely different geopolitical alignment, potentially a new Iron Curtain, right, in whichever way Russia survives this. So maybe I'll end here and we can continue discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. I just have a quick follow-up question. So you talked about Putin underestimating the strength of the Ukrainian nation. And I think it's fair to say that certainly European countries also did. We've all been so impressed by the unity of Ukraine and the standing up. And we've had discussions in the Baltic states, I know, where we've asked, you know, would we do the same thing? Would we be ready to you know, fight a potential occupier in the same way? And what do you think is the source of this unity? And were you surprised yourself, perhaps, by the extent to which Ukrainians have united against the Russian military threat?
Well, I mean, I think probably books will be written by anybody from, you know, cultural historians to psychologists about sort of like the sources of this. I don't think there is any simple answer to that. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not the first instance of mass mobilization in Ukraine, right? So I think Ukrainians, even if we think back to 2004, right, like the Orange Revolution, when there was, you know, Yanukovych tried to come to power the first time, right? And there was, you know, Kuchma regime, that was after the murder of Gongadze, it was pretty authoritarian, right? And then Ukrainians succeeded in overthrowing that, you know, outcome of this rigged elections. I think that gave people kind of direct experience in people power. I mean, I think that's important because it's one thing to read about like how ancestors, you know, in the Cossack period, like the Cossacks, you know, beat the, I don't know, the Russian army, the Crimean Tatars or whatever, like this distant history, right? And I think it's a difference to have an experience more directly. And of course, in 2014, that was another instance of mass mobilization that also was successful. So I think that's part of it. I think also, again, sort of from cultural standpoint, like I'm not a cultural historian, as a political scientist, I'm always skeptical of these sort of like fuzzy cultural explanations, but I think there is something to it. I mean, there is a history of Ukraine of this kind of decentralized rule, right? Like of no deference to authority, like they have in Russia, right? Like this Cossack, you know, republic of, you know, from the 17th, 16th century, kind of like, I think it's partly, I mean, again, I'm just kind of speculate here a little bit. I think this is partly what gives Ukraine this image of this kind of like disorganized, corrupt, sort of not very well-run place, because there is no vertical of power, right? The sort of vertical of power was never very strong, right? Like in other words, there are all these pockets of sort of independent activity and people doing their own thing. And sometimes it leads to, you know, basically kind of harder to say get things done, right? Like some laws don't get implemented, but I think it also allows for these sorts of pockets of societal mobilization. And we see that now there is no really centralized way in which this resistance is run. This is like a lot of it is grassroots. And even in the army, I mean, I'm no military specialist, but I read recently an account that one of the reasons by some military experts who said the reason the army is doing, you know, as well as it's doing, because it is not very centralized. Basically, it operates in these sort of smaller mobile units that, you know, they don't necessarily rely on like centralized command and control. And that was one of the reasons why Ukrainian army was considered not to be suitable for NATO, not ready for NATO, right? But it's actually proves itself, this sort of decentralization proves itself to be an asset now, even in fighting, you know, on the front. So I think these are the kinds of things that I would say played some role. I don't know how exactly, right? But I think that would be something that comes to mind.
Thank you, Oksana. And now I turn to Dovilė. Dovilė, so you have one foot in the USA and another, of course, in Lithuania. Perhaps you can tell us something about the Lithuanian perspective on these events.
Thank you so much. And again, it's a real honor to be part of the panel. So my writing has been on memory and trauma and international relations. So the way I approach the issue would be through the insights from this literature. So I think, you know, one of the major insights from those who write about memory and trauma and international relations is very simple, that trauma affects identity formation, that the experience of trauma leads to the creation of new identities and new discourses. And undoubtedly, the cruel war in Ukraine and the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II has been a severe trauma for millions of people. This should not be forgotten. And when it comes to Lithuania, it has become an existential threat, not only to Ukraine, but also to Lithuania, and I would argue even to the whole Europe. So we already seeing drastic changes in European identities. And I think Europe is starting to believe in itself, and even perhaps it increases its willingness to fight for European ideals and values, such as human rights and democracy, which I think are not just empty concepts anymore. And I think that when it comes to Lithuania, and not just Lithuania, but also Lithuanian diaspora, which is an influential actor in the equation, by and large, I think fully identify with Ukraine. And I would go as far as to say that Ukraine's war has already become Lithuania's war. One of my colleagues in Lithuania remarked, we are all in front lines now. And I think that increasingly as the time goes on, the slogan, we are all Ukrainians now, goes beyond Lithuania, beyond Europe, and it even has become a source of global solidarity with Ukraine and Ukrainians. And I think later on we will discuss whether or not this solidarity actually has translated into actions, specific actions to help Ukraine. Here I also would like to say that, you know, this Lithuanian emotional attachment to Ukraine, identification with Ukraine is not a new phenomenon. We saw this in 2014 already. Lithuania started feeling this existential uncertainty, related anxieties in 2014. It started delivering weapons to Ukraine. Here, I would also like to mention that I think it's not a coincidence at all that Lithuania and Ukraine has kind of similar memory regimes consolidated around the experiences of previous traumas, Holodomor in the case of Ukraine, and also deportations under Stalin. And I think at least partially this explains this immediate identification of Lithuanians with Ukrainians, as well as their emotional adoption of Ukraine's war. I'd like to briefly quote a 50-year-old man in Vilnius who said, my grandparents were sent away to Siberia. My father was persecuted by the KGB. Now I live in a free democratic country, but it seems as nothing can be taken for granted. And I think this is how indeed many Lithuanians feel right now. And it's not surprising at all that one of the most emotional debates in Lithuania has been whether NATO should be more directly involved, because Ukraine is seen as part of the same community of fate that Lithuanians are part of. Here I would also like to mention, sort of building on what Oksana already said, that indeed I'm very concerned about Russia's role, and we saw indeed how memory wars of the past actually became actual war. I will not be the first to note that, but it's not a coincidence at all that right before the invasion in Ukraine, Russia strengthened its memory law, banning any comparison between USSR and Stalin and Nazi Germany and denying responsibility for the start of World War II. And this is, again, exerting control about how the war is remembered, and the lies about the World War II, I mean, it's definitely related to the current information campaign, and he continues to wage this war based on these lies, denying Ukraine's right to exist. As we are seeing new traumatic memories making, I think that I definitely also would agree with Oxana that we are seeing some major geopolitical changes that are going to last for a very long time. We are seeing new lines of division emerging, and it's very clear that Ukraine and Lithuania is part of the European community of fate. Together, without any doubt. I would like to briefly mention a couple of observations about the United States, because I'm based in the United States as well. And here also, I think it's kind of amazing that we see strong identification of the Americans with Ukraine. Also, the slogan, "We are all Ukrainians now," is repeated in op-eds, protest actions. The Ukrainian resistance is indeed becoming iconic. And I think what's actually quite amazing about the United States, one of the major problems in the United States has been this acute polarization, right? Some even argue that this is the big threat to American democracy, but it seems like Ukrainian resistance became so iconic that actually brought the two parties together. We see some bipartisan solidarity on the issue, and despite the huge inflation, majority of Americans continue to support sanctions, even if they are hurting financially. So I think that this is an important development. And given that the US is a multi-ethnic society, there's also, we very clearly even see some even empathy, envy from some sectors saying, you know, that Ukraine indeed is getting a lot of empathy. So again, I think that we will probably discuss a little bit further how this solidarity, how this emotional identification with Ukraine actually translates into foreign policy actions. But I think that, at least in my eyes, one thing is clear, either Europe or the United States, that identification, solidarity with Ukraine has revitalized commitment to values associated with the liberal world order. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dovilė. And now we turn to, we sweep northwards towards Toronto in Canada. And Andris, of course, you're physically based in Toronto, but your heart very much belongs to Estonia. How do you feel being all the way over there in Toronto with these events taking place in Northern and Central Europe, and touching on the country where you spent so many years?
Well, on a personal level, I'm thinking of my best Canadian Estonian friend, who was also, like me, the son of Estonian refugees in Canada who moved back to Estonia, who is just today welcoming a Ukrainian refugee family into his home in Dublin. But let me go back to the question you asked Oksana about how the Ukrainians have united in the face of this Russian onslaught. And as the historian on the panel, thinking of the wider Baltic Sea region, then of course the parallel for this war is the Soviet invasion of Finland, the Winter War in 1939-40, which went disastrously for the Soviet military, because they had in the same way overestimated the will to resist, because there had been a civil war. Finland was also a divided country between Reds and Whites in 1918. And Stalin, like Putin now, had believed that the Red Army would be welcomed by the Finns. The Finnish working class would see it as liberation from the junta, from the white regime in Helsinki. And of course, by invading Finland, Stalin united the Finns. Now, turning to the Baltic states, and then maybe a little bit later to the Canadian responses as well, that first and foremost, I think this is not just, doesn't only pertain to Estonia, but the analysis has always been regarding Ukraine that the cornerstone. Mart Laar, when he was the first prime minister, said this out loud, but it's an idea that Zbigniew Brzezinski has written about a long time ago, that is quoted often, that Russia without Ukraine is not an empire. And thus, this has always been sort of a strategic concern for Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians to ensure that Ukraine is not just independent, sovereign, and democratic, but that it becomes closer to the West. And correspondingly, of course, Putin, of course, has also realized that Russia is not an empire without Ukraine and must have this peace back. So Estonia, like Latvia and Lithuania, has been supporting, well, not only through NATO, but much more importantly and significantly, and recall all this stuff began, the Maidan in 2013, 2014 began with the European Union Association Agreement, had nothing to do with NATO. And there, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and particularly Lithuania, was at the forefront of trying to integrate Ukraine closer into the European Union, which the Western Europeans were not at all enthusiastic about. So that's been a sort of a strategic concern for both in terms of NATO and the European Union for the Baltic states right from day one. Now coming to sort of the current invasion, what has been the response of Estonians? I already mentioned sort of on the personal level, welcoming refugees, massive demonstrations, the largest demonstrations really in the country or protests since the drive to regain independence at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s in support of Ukraine. There was a debate amongst military men. Estonia was one of the first countries to provide, and the same applies to Lithuania, of course, lethal aid to Ukraine already more than a month ago, when hardly anyone else was doing so. And there was a debate within Estonia because Estonia was providing javelins, exactly what the Ukrainians needed, but something that the Estonians only had a few of themselves and which are pretty expensive. And there was a public debate that, well, is this such a good idea? Don't we need these ourselves? Why should we be giving them away? Aren't we putting ourselves at risk? But in retrospect, of course, it was the right thing to do. And I think, like Dovilė said, that Estonians are also perceiving themselves as being very much on the front line now. Rushing ahead to perhaps a question that someone might ask, and which journalists tend to ask, do the Baltic states feel that they might be next? That was a question that was asked in 2014, that was asked in 2008 after Georgia. But I would say right now, looking at the Russian military performance in Ukraine, the Baltic states can rest easy. That the performance of the Russian military has been so poor that their hands will be full with Ukraine for the foreseeable future, that they have no possibility to encroach on the Baltic states, which are members of NATO. And of course, from a Baltic point of view, purely egoistically, from a Baltic point of view, this crisis has enhanced our security in the sense that the NATO enhanced forward presence has been nearly doubled by Western allies pledging, because they're not willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, they're compensating by showing NATO unity and bringing more men and women into and equipment into the Baltic states. And maybe this will become a permanent thing rather than this persistent sort of rotation as it is at the moment. Daunis, do I have time to say a few words about Canada?
Yeah, go on, you have a minute.
Okay, so short about Canada has the largest diaspora of Ukrainians anywhere. So Canada has been one of the most supportive countries in terms of Ukraine. And Canada generally, of course, follows the US in its foreign policy, but Ukraine is one of the places where Canada has actually usually led, going back to recognizing Ukraine's independence before the Americans did, for instance, back in '91, and being a proponent of the strongest and most maximum sanctions. Of course, compared to Europeans, Canadians don't feel the pinch very much because their trade relations with Russia or dependence on Russia is very minimal. So it's easy to be more gung-ho about the sanctions. And there's a personal role here too, that the second most powerful person in Canada is Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and who used to be the Foreign Minister, who is from the Ukrainian diaspora herself and is sort of the most passionate person in leading the file in this case. So what has Canada done? It's, for instance, all Ukrainians who are here now have had their, including students, they've extended their visas. They can stay as long as, I guess it has been extended for a 3-year period, or as long as the current conflict goes on. Canada is stepping up its support for NATO. The Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, will be in Riga tomorrow talking about the commitment to NATO. And that's significant because, in fact, the Canadian Prime Minister has been to the Baltic States only once before in the entire history of the Baltic States. And that's Trudeau when he came to announce the Enhanced Forward Presence mission back in 2017. So perhaps I'll stop there, and I'll have more to say during the Q&A.
Thank you, Andres. And having reviewed the big picture of events going on and also reflected on the Baltic response and also the North American response, I'd just like to narrow down for a moment our discussion, because after all, we are a scholarly organization. Oxana represents a scholarly organization. And I think it would be important for us to think about our colleagues and students in Ukraine. And Oxana, what is happening sort of on the ground as regards universities and researchers? I presume that the education system has stopped, more or less, but do you have some sort of information on what is happening with our colleagues? And your microphone, please.
Sorry, I was muted. There are quite a few initiatives now. First of all, some of the universities actually, I'm specifically thinking now of the Kyiv School of Economics, which is based in Kyiv. It has a lot of, former prominent economists, including people who used to be part of the government in different periods as advisors. They continue to give talks, and they actually open to being invited to speak to the audiences globally. We actually hosting at Tufts, a group of them, virtually. The Association for the Study of Nationalities, I think, has a panel today that brings scholars, from Ukraine. I think there are initiatives with Western lecturers, sort of lecturing to their students, on Zoom. So I think at least some of the educational communities are trying to, again, who knows how it will be sustainable. And of course, normal, quote unquote, teaching in the classroom has obviously stopped. But, and many scholars are now in the territorial defense and doing things that, scholars typically don't do. But there are sort of continued scholarly engagements, right? There is also, within the US at least, multiple universities participate in the Scholar at Risk program. So there have been a lot of sort of email lists. I can maybe, when other people are talking, I can send a few resources in the chat. There's basically now like Google documents and a few lists of, for example, universities outside of Ukraine that may be willing to host scholars from Ukraine who are displaced or graduate students, right? So that's something like if, say, your universities want to get involved in, you can, maybe find a contact person, add the name to that live Google sheet, and it's obviously all in early stages, but there are efforts, to do this. I mean, one thing I would also mention for the scholarly work, it's if the invasion goes, for a while and Russian forces are able to capture more territory, we could really talk about a profound loss of cultural and scholarly material. They already destroyed a few museums. If you think about the archival access, like in Ukraine, for example, KGB archives have been open that researchers are studying. Of course, this would probably be one of the first things that the Russians would seek to destroy. The museums also, given Putin's goal of quote unquote denazification, right, in Ukraine. And of course, what he means by denazification is any reading of Soviet history that is not to his liking, right? We're not talking about some sort of objective, support for Nazism. It is study of the famine in the 30s, right? Like the events of the Second World War, basically anything and everything that departs from his glorified vision of the Soviet past, right, would be in danger, including scholars who work on this, but also resources in the museums and so forth. So I think this is something definitely to watch. There is now an initiative that I believe is trying to digitize holdings of, various museums and cultural centers that have this material, right, before, say, these towns, if they fall to the Russian forces. They're actually looking for volunteers. So if anybody has, I think they're specifically looking for people like librarians and who have like in humanities, who have experience with working with cultural stuff or like artifacts. I can, once other people are talking, I can try to send a few of these links in the chat.
Thank you, Oksana. And yeah, and please do add it to the chat. But before you do that, we're going to turn to the questions now. We've had quite a few questions come in. And I'd like to address the first one, perhaps to you, Oksana, which is, so many analysts and commentators suggest that the end game in this crisis will involve negotiations and compromise. Michael writes, I'm worried about what this might mean. Is Ukraine supposed to let Russia keep Crimea and take the Donbass too? I worry that the result could be a reward for Putin after all his aggression. Do you know of other better scenarios for terms of negotiation?
Yeah, so, I mean, many people, including in Ukraine, worry about it. I was talking to my aunt the other day and like sort of, asking like how she's doing. She stayed in Kyiv, like what is she worried about? She has two worries. One is to find pet food and the other one is that Zelensky will concede too much. These are her worries. She's hiding in some basement, So I think any kind of like profound concession, I think would be very difficult. As you say, as the questioner said, would reward Russian aggression. I would also draw the distinction between Crimea and Donbass, right? I think, at least as of today, I think any kind of formal recognition of Crimean annexation is unlikely. At the same time, I also don't see, Ukraine sort of trying at any point in time to take Crimea over militarily, right? So that may become sort of the status quo, kind of as it was before, right? Some sort of maybe down the road, some sort of potential for settlements, like different status, I don't know, right? But I think it's unlikely, as I said, that there would be actual formal recognition of this. And as far as Donbass, this is a different story. It's both a different story for Russia and for Ukraine. Because if, say, annexation of Crimea was very popular in Russia, in Donbass, I don't think there is such great, support for this. And more importantly, people in Donbass actually have different preferences. We see now the government-controlled parts of Donbass that, of course, these unrecognized republics claim as theirs, right? The parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast that remained under government control after 2014, much different set of attitudes there, and even more anti-Russian now after they're leveling villages there. There are videos coming out of people in Donbass raising Ukrainian flags, replacing the DNR flags with Ukrainian flags. So I think any kind of sort of Ukraine conceding these territories, to me, this seems very unlikely, right? But sort of more generally, I think the settlement would depend on how things go on the battlefield and how badly things go for Russia domestically. Because even today, Putin's press secretary is now talking about just recognizing Donbass and Crimea, and he's no longer talking about denazification, quote unquote, and demilitarization, right? Which seems like a change from Russian position before, because what exactly denazification meant, it essentially meant some sort of pro-Russian puppet regime and repression against anybody, as I said, who disagreed with sort of Putin's view on the Soviet past. That obviously was not sustainable now at least as of today, they're not talking about it. If they're not talking about demilitarization, like what does it mean? Like, do they want, potentially Zelensky can stay in power, right? Like Ukraine can, continue develop its military. It's not joining NATO, okay? It wasn't joining it even before. Like, what exactly Russia want then? Like, they already controlled this LNR and DNR in Crimea, so that seems also sort of unclear what's in it, for the Russians. So I think it is really a race against time. I think every day Ukraine doesn't win, it doesn't lose, it wins. There is continued support, the people are standing, the army getting resupplied. Things in Russia can only go worse than they are now. There is no way sort of things within Russia can improve. So Putin really put himself in the situation where it's like, he has very few options. He can continue bombing cities. That seems to be really the only option that he has. So at least as of today, to answer to this question, I don't really see this sort of, Ukrainian government conceding like the things that Putin is demanding that they concede. And just one last point I'll add, I think there is also profound misunderstanding with this puppet government. I mean, there were reports today that Yanukovych, former president, flew to Minsk apparently, right? And that, you know, they may want to have sort of humor installed. Like anybody who knows Ukraine would be like, what are you possibly thinking? Like, what legitimacy would he have? He would like not have legitimacy outside of whatever office he may sit with Russian soldiers around him. Like that would be the extent of that, you know. So, but I think in Putin's Russia, there is profound mistrust for democracy, so that it's even real, this sort of idea of people power. I mean, he believes Maidan was, you know, paid with CIA money. So this idea that like you can just install somebody in the top and that's like all it takes, really again goes to this deep misunderstanding, I think, of Ukraine specifically and of democratic system generally among the Russian leadership.
Thanks, Oksana. And we're going to turn to the Baltics for a couple of questions now. And I'm going to start with you, Andris. A question has come in from the audience asking, how have recent events affected relations between the general populace and Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia?
Well, actually, Daunis, you're in a better position to answer that than I am, sitting in Riga and me watching this from Toronto. But obviously, that's a moment of tension because there are plenty of, first of all, Russian citizens and stateless persons in both Estonia and Latvia whose loyalties are dubious and who are used to getting most of their information from Russian media sources. So there have been instances of people driving around cities in Estonia with the Zorro or Zet, or I would say the zombie sign, which is the sort of substitute for swastika for the invaders, showing their support. What has happened also is finally the Russian media has been taken down. Estonia was very reluctant to do so in terms of banning Russian channels. But what has happened is under public pressure, it hasn't been the state, but actually the operators, Telia, which is a Scandinavian company which controls most of the telecommunications in Estonia, but probably Latvia and Lithuania as well. They themselves, under public pressure, removed the Russian channels from their television standard package offering, which has sort of made a lot of Russian viewers upset because they're used to those channels and they can't understand why they've disappeared. Maybe I'll throw the question back to you, Daunis.
Yeah, well, as somebody who's participated in a few demonstrations, including on Saturday, we had 30,000 people on a march, on a rally past the Russian embassy and to the Ukrainian embassy, where we had some stirring speeches from our president and other leading members in society. That it was very much an international crowd, Latvian, Russian, Ukrainian, and actually other languages as well, because we have quite a few international students here in Latvia, were heard. It also seemed to be quite generational, although I don't have any specific data on this, but I did have the feeling that I was sort of amongst the older people taking part in the march, and that there were a lot of young student-age people of all nationalities taking part in the demonstration. And there does seem to be a sort of generational dimension to this, but I really don't have any sort of further information about that. And Dovilė, how about in Lithuania? Has there been a sort of generational reaction to this in any way, or do you think?
Right. I mean, right. I have a feeling that it has been very much, a mobilizing experience for people from different generations. There has been definitely interest from, my parents' generation, and who lived all of their lives during the Soviet times. And, the argument is we don't want to go back to that. But I think, if we look at the engagement of young people, I mean, I'm amazed at the mobilization of Lithuanian civil society and how actively young people participate in NGO activities that try to help the territorial defense, that try to help refugees. I think that actually it's kind of quite amazing at the level of the support of society from different generations, different age groups for the cause. I think in the United States, I mean, sometimes people talk about rally around the flag effect. So I think it's something similar in Lithuania, that it's definitely an experience that has mobilized society. And I am aware that, you know, in Lithuania, we also have ethnic minorities, Russians, and also ethnic Poles. And there have been, at least in social media, some people were arguing that we need to be very careful with the rhetoric. We need to make sure that, you know, we do not see ethnic divisions, because that sometimes happens during the war. But it looks like even the ethnic Polish leader actually denounced the war, even though in the past he has been, you know, associated with Russia. So that's at least some of my insights from Lithuania.
Thank you, Dovilė. And we have a question from one of our colleagues on the board, from Joe Ellis here as well, who writes, as Dr. Budrytė pointed out, there has been an unbelievable amount of bipartisan agreement on this question in the US. How has this invasion impacted political cleavages in the Baltics, broadly speaking? And he's thinking specifically about the Reform Party in EKRE in Estonia. So before I ask Andris to fill us in on EKRE, I can say that in Latvia, it's been quite remarkable that the long-standing pro-Kremlin party, as it's known, Harmony Social Democracy, which about 5 years ago broke the contract, the cooperation agreement it had with Putin's party, but still has generally been seen as a sort of pro-Kremlin party, was actually quite quick and swift to speak out against the conflict, severely criticized and distanced itself from Russia, from Putin, and came down wholeheartedly on the side of Russia. Wholeheartedly on the side of Ukraine on this, in an unequivocal way. Whereas the populists in Latvia, a couple of new parties that have been trying to make a name for themselves, have gotten themselves into an awful mess about this thing. But I think in the case of Latvia, it's quite interesting that the traditional pro-Russian party, which is also the biggest party in Latvia, for the last 10 years, it's had the biggest share of seats in the parliament, has come out as strongly pro-Putin. Pro-Ukraine. I have to stop saying that, pro-Ukraine. Andris, what about the political parties in Estonia?
Right. Well, finally, the Center Party, which is in the government, which has the largest Russian electorate, finally, the other day, quietly dropped or canceled its cooperation agreement with United Russia, which they didn't do in 2014, when there was a lot of pressure for them to do so. And they didn't do so when Jüri Ratas, their leader, was prime minister a couple of years ago. But now, finally, they have done so. I think what Joseph's question is addressing is something that I've also noticed, that the Estonian far-right party, which is ultra-nationalist, but sort of functions in the Kremlin's interest, in my opinion, EKRE, they had been in past years demonizing Ukrainian laborers in Estonia. They'd been trying to make inroads with the Russian speakers and take them away from the Center Party, their usual electorate, and try to win over the Russian speakers to the Estonian far right by claiming that they were on their side because the Russian speakers in Estonia they have more manual labor, lower paying jobs, higher unemployment than ethnic Estonians, and that Ukrainians who were coming to Estonia in past years to work were stealing the jobs of the ethnic Russians. So the Estonian far right was playing on that. So it's to be kind of interesting to see how they're maneuvering now with this sort of general sort of nationalist feeling in support of Ukraine and against Russia, and how that sort of inter-ethnic mix of having a large portion of Russians in society, but also a significant number of Ukrainians. And now there will, of course, be more and more Ukrainians coming in as refugees, and how that response will have to change.
Thank you, Andris. Well, we're moving into the last 10 minutes of our discussion now. So we're going to move to our closing statements. Thank you so much to everybody who sent in the questions. We simply don't have time to go through them all in our 60 minutes today. But Dovilė, I'd like to turn to you first of all and ask you to reflect. I mean, how do you think that things will play out over the coming weeks and months?
Thank you so much, Daunis. Without any doubt, it's a complicated question, and political scientists, we know we try to predict the past, the future, but we continue to fail with that. I mean, I kind of think in terms of several scenarios, what could happen. And again, we talked a lot about already during the panel about the failures of the Russian military. I mean, I just was listening to the Lithuanian media prior to this panel, and there was talk about when is the Russian military going to collapse, right? I mean, we're talking about definitely not, it looks like there's no such thing as victory for Russia that, you know, we thought about perhaps in the past. So it seems to me that we are looking at the weakening of Russia. And we look at, you know, Russia, in a sense, being bogged down. And one of the questions that continues to be asked, you know, as Putin is basically seeing that, you know, he's not winning as much as he wanted, that he's losing, is there some kind of potential about the use of nuclear weapons, right? So I hope not. I mean, I hope that the scenario will be avoided. And in the likelihood of the Russia under regime change, right, there's also a possibility that again, that Russia will be unstable. But this is, again, in my eyes, this would be an outcome that I think many of us would like to see. That, again, we see, even though the impact of the sanctions might not be immediate, and it might take some while to get that. So, without any doubt, I mean, I know that I'm talking in a sense in broad terms, but we're definitely seeing, I think, a new beginning, and it's inherently unstable. So it's, I mean, in my eyes, it's kind of difficult to predict if and when, again, we are going to see a regime change in Russia.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you this question, and I know you'll be annoyed by it, but do you think Vladimir Putin will still be president in 12 months' time?
Difficult to answer, but I definitely hope not, because I think it's, I mean, what I'm seeing right now in Russia, I'm seeing definitely a lot of dissatisfaction with the government. I'm seeing that people are going out into the streets, even though I wish more of them went out into the streets. But I think that, again, even though I had doubts myself about the impact of sanctions, from what I gather, if indeed we are on the same path, if they're going to continue, if we are going to see, you know, a sustained economic war against Russia, I think that indeed, because the sanctions are multilateral, not just you know, coming from the United States, but also the Europeans signed up on those. So I'm hoping that indeed we're going to see the regime change sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Dovilė. And Andris, same question to you. How do you see events panning out in the coming days, weeks, and months?
Well, I'll try to be brief, and I'll also answer Robert's question from the Q&A in my response. I'm not going to talk about the perspective for Ukraine and Russia. I agree a lot with what Dovilė said, but the perspective for the Baltic states, I think we will come out of this in a much stronger position as Russia is weakened and NATO is strengthened. And basically the analysis of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, which we had been telling the Western Europeans all these years that Russia is on a dangerous course, that our analysis has been sort of justified. And if Putin's main sort of stated objective, of course, was against NATO enlargement, the most positive result that might come out of this is Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The crisis has risen sort of the popularity of NATO to above 50% in both of those countries. The Finnish president was in Washington talking about NATO with Joe Biden on Friday. The Finnish prime minister is in Estonia today talking NATO. The Estonian prime minister, this is response to Robert's question, told her that Estonia would ratify Finnish NATO application with lightning speed, which I have no doubt. So we had the promise of, if Putin's whole justification was all about NATO enlargement, and of course, unfortunately, so many Western and particularly American IR, international relations scholars who still like swallow that it's all about this, unfortunate NATO expansion into the Baltic States, which is to blame for all this. Well, Putin's going to get the opposite out of it. His own actions is going to cause the Baltic Sea region, the Baltic Sea, to become a NATO lake when Finland and Sweden join, thanks to Putin's own reckless actions.
Thank you, Andris. And Oksana, finally, we turn to you. And what do you think we should do over the next coming days, weeks, and months? And I mean that both as individuals, as the people who are here participating in this platform, but also what do you think Ukraine's allies should do to help?
Yeah, well, I think in the kind of immediate, I think military aid is key, because this really depends what sort of scenarios we're going to look at, down the road. I think it all depends if and how long Ukrainian military can hold, because if, say, Ukraine is defeated militarily, decisively, then we're really talking about sort of concentration style, like repression, in the heart of Europe, like tens of millions probably of refugees, like complete sort of, severe occupational administration, like, just basically like a black hole there, right? So I think, but the more time goes on, I would echo what Dovilė is saying. I think processes were set off in Russia that we did not expect, that nobody could predict. And I think the fallout there would be tremendous. We don't know what form it takes, but I think any sort of things that were seemed impossible before, I would say anything from a palace coup to the collapse of the military to some sort of, North Korean style repressive regime turned inwards. I think any of these things are an option, but Russia does not have the resources or the manpower to win this war. I think that's pretty clear. So I think the most important thing would be, it seems like, no-fly zone or boots on the ground has been ruled out. Although, again, like if Putin continues to carpet bomb cities, and now granted he's just in the east of the country, there are still many more cities, right, I wouldn't even exclude. I mean, in a way, I think NATO is already in conflict with Russia. I mean, his whole, Putin, Ukraine is a puppet. I mean, he's really at war with the West, right? Like it's, so I think that should be clear. I think it's clear for many people in the Baltic states, but not like in, Berlin and elsewhere. So I think, military aid would be the most important thing, like the fighter jets, right, that Ukrainian pilots can fly, the old MiGs. I think that's key because, air defense, the air defense systems. So I think, the more, if you have air of your government or, if you're a citizen, I encourage everybody in the US to write to the elected representatives and tell them, make sure that happens and happens like now. And then, of course, once this war is over, and it will be over, either Russia generates tremendous destruction on Ukraine or smaller scale destruction before it is defeated, then I think massive sort of reconstruction effort would be in order. I think Ukraine clearly should be in Europe. I mean, I've actually just wrote a piece, it should be coming out hopefully soon with a colleague, not for charity. But if you look at sort of what happened, how effective the state is, how effective the military is, democratic system, all of these things, I think Ukraine clearly is a European country. I don't think there is any sort of like it's not ready kind of thing, right? And then they'll probably, if Russia survives this, right, if there is no disintegration within Russia, like if Putin or as a leader survives, right, I think it would be a new Iron Curtain. I think the question is like where it falls, right? Of course, if Putin falls and there is a regime change in Russia, that would be yet another possibility to consider. But I think, to your question, to the first thing, I think military aid for Ukraine now is key because every day, literally every day matters.
Thank you, Oksana, and thank you also to our panelists, Andris and Dovilė, for participating today. And my apologies to those of you who submitted questions, especially my sister-in-law. We didn't get around to her question. So my apologies for not being able to answer all these things, but we did have our 60-minute time limit today. And I think, generally speaking, the tone of our conversation has been quite optimistic, forward-looking. Yes, these are tough times. They will be tough days and weeks ahead. But broadly speaking, I think we can look to a brighter European future, and a European future that includes Ukraine at the heart of Europe, when we look to the post-crisis Europe. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for this AABS discussion, and we hope to see you again, either at another meeting like this, or at our conference in Seattle in May, or one of our other events. Thanks, and bye-bye.